Diane Louise Augat lived what many would consider a typical life. Throughout the 1970s and early 80s, she lived a quiet life as a stay-at-home mom, raising 3 children with her husband in Florida. But over time, the life she had built began to fracture. Slowly at first, then all at once. In 1988, Diane was diagnosed with manic depression, and from there, everything seemed to spiral downwards. She was prescribed medication but struggled to stick with it. Later that same year, her children were taken from her care, her marriage fell apart not long after, and the divorce was finalized in 1991. By then, Diane had become a familiar face to local authorities, mostly for minor offenses and calls about her mental health. According to her mother, Diane was committed under Florida's Baker Act more than 30 times, a law that allows individuals to be held for psychiatric evaluation if they're seen as a danger to themselves or others. It was a pattern Diane couldn't seem to shake. Breakdown, hospitalization, release, repeat. Just weeks before she disappeared, she was back in a psychiatric facility. Her family begged for long-term care, for someone to finally step in and keep her safe from herself. But instead, Diane was released, once again sent out on her own. And this time, she never came back. On April 11, 1998, Diane was last seen walking north along U.S. Highway 19 near New York Avenue in Hudson, Florida. Just 2 days later, the phone rang at Diane's mother's home. She wasn't home at the time, but the answering machine caught it. The voice that came through the static was unmistakable. "Help! Help! Let me out!" Then a struggle, the muffled sound of movement, maybe a scuffle, like someone fighting to hold on to the phone. Then Diane's voice again. "Hey, gimme that." Then the line went dead. The caller ID traced the number to a business called Starlight in Odessa, Florida. Her mother immediately called it back. No answer. By the time police looked into it, there was no trace of Diane at that location, and no sign she had ever been there. And 2 days after the voicemail was left, things took an even darker turn. On April 15th, just 4 days after Diane was last seen, a grim discovery was made along U.S. Highway 19, near the exact spot where she had last been seen. It was the severed tip of a human finger. It had been cut cleanly, just above the knuckle, with the fingernail still painted red. Authorities later confirmed that it was Diane's right middle finger. Whispers started to spread about a possible second finger being found nearby as well, but when deputies arrived on scene, only one was found. And then, a week later, another clue surfaced. Inside the outdoor freezer of a convenience store in Odessa, someone found a plastic bag. Inside were Diane's clothes. Every item was neatly folded, pristine, untouched. No fingerprints, no blood, no sign of who left it there, and no sign of Diane. Then, in 2000, just 1 day after the St. Petersburg Times ran a story about Diane's case, the mystery deepened again. This time, the clue turned up at a Circle K convenience store in Pasco County, Florida, and the person who found it wasn't a stranger. It was Diane's brother's girlfriend. Inside a clear zip-top bag marked with the name Diane written in bold black marker were several of her belongings: black eyeliner, a bottle of Taboo perfume, bright pink lipstick, and a small tube of toothpaste. To most people, it might have looked like a tossed-out bag of drugstore purchases. But Diane's mom saw it differently. She recognized them right away. The makeup, the perfume, it was the kind of stuff Diane always carried. And that toothpaste was the same brand she'd been issued during her last stay at the mental health facility. It was unsettling. Too specific to be coincidence. Still, there was no way to prove the items were actually Diane's. There were no surveillance cameras, and no one saw who left it. But the timing, the location, the label on the bag, paired with everything else that had already happened, it felt deliberate. More than 2 decades have passed since Diane Augat disappeared. But the bizarre trail of clues she left behind still haunts anyone who's followed her story. Diane Louise Augat is a white female with dark blonde hair and blue eyes. Her ears are pierced, and she had her fingernails painted a bright coral red when she disappeared. She has a scar on her abdomen and tattoos on her back and right shoulder. Diane may also go by the last name Young. If you have any information about the disappearance of Diane Augat, please contact the Pasco County Sheriff's Office at 1-800-854-2862. Even the smallest detail could help bring long overdue answers to a mystery that's remained unsolved for far too long. Kelly Berg Dove, born on August 30th, 1961, was just 20 years old when she vanished without a trace. She'd bbeen working the late shift at the Imperial gas station on South Main Street in Harrisonburg, Virginia. It was June 18th, 1982, on a quiet stretch of road about a mile south of James Madison University. Her sisters worked at the station too, but that night, Kelly had swapped shifts and she was working alone. During her shift, Kelly called the Harrisonburg police 3 separate times. The first time, she reported a man inside the store harassing her. She let them know she was by herself and asked if someone could keep an eye on the place. Not long after, she called again. The same man had come back. This time, she said he was dressed improperly. It's never been clear what she meant by that. Possibly that he was exposing himself. At 2:30 a.m., Kelly made a third call. She sounded scared. The man had returned once more, and now he was using the payphone outside the store to make obscene calls right to the gas station where Kelly was working. She told police he was driving a silver or gray Ford and she pleaded for help. Moments later, the line went dead. When officers arrived, it had only been a few minutes, but Kelly was gone. Her purse was still sitting on the counter. A magazine lay open beside it, and a cigarette burned all the way down to the filter in the ashtray. But there was no sign of a robbery, no struggle, and no trace of Kelly. Police believe her abduction may have taken just seconds, and that her attacker was likely armed. Her family says Kelly would have fought back if she could. Another clerk working at a nearby convenience store that night reported seeing a man come in roughly 30 minutes before Kelly disappeared. The man was driving a gray car and described as being in his early 20s, with shoulder-length blonde hair. But police were never able to confirm if he had anything to do with Kelly's case. According to her sisters, obscene calls and creepy behavior from customers were all too common, especially on the night shift. But after Kelly went missing, the harassment stopped. In the 6 weeks that followed, the gas station received just one inappropriate phone call. Kelly's parents believe they know who was responsible, a former high school classmate of Kelly's with a known history of exposing himself and making obscene calls. He was never publicly named and never charged. Police, on the other hand, think it was more likely a random crime of opportunity, someone who saw Kelly working alone in an isolated station and made a decision. At the time, Kelly was married and had a 4-year-old daughter. She lived in Bridgewater, Virginia, and her family described her as a devoted mother and wife with no reason to walk away from her life. She was declared legally dead in 1989. But what happened to Kelly Dove in those early morning hours of June 18, 1982, is still a mystery. If you have any information about her disappearance, please contact the Harrisonburg Police Department at 540-434-2545. Michael Anthony McLean was last seen in Nashua, New Hampshire on the night of April 21, 2019. It started out like any other night, when he went out with friends to the Tropical Lounge, a nightclub on Hollis Street. But things took a turn when an argument broke out in the parking lot between 2 women, one of whom he knew. He stepped in trying to calm things down, but it wasn't long before the situation got out of control. The crowd didn't clear until the police arrived around 1:45 a.m. In the confusion, McLean got separated from his friends. A short while later, he made a call to his boss. "They're after me, more than one." What followed were 3 strange texts sent to a neighbor. The first one read, "Help LOL hour." The second, "What stood aloof?" And the third, "Eldridge bro." The bizarre, disjointed messages led investigators to believe Michael had been using voice dictation, trying to communicate but possibly in distress. And the final message, "Eldridge bro," was odd, with some speculating he could have been referring to Eldridge Street, which runs near the club, but no one knows for sure. Surveillance footage later showed him at a McDonald's around 2 a.m. Then, about an hour and a half later, cameras caught him entering and exiting a nearby parking garage at Riverfront Landing, near Bancroft Street and the Merrimack River. That's the last confirmed sighting of him. After that, nothing. The next day, McLean didn't show up for work. It was Easter weekend, and his absence raised immediate alarms. This wasn't like him. He didn't call his mom. He didn't check in with his grandmother or sister, even though it was her birthday, something he never forgot. All calls to his phone went straight to voicemail. At the time of his disappearance, Michael Anthony McLean was working for Easter Seals, New Hampshire, a nonprofit dedicated to helping people with disabilities, veterans, and the elderly. He worked with autistic children, a job he was passionate about. He had a degree in criminal justice and was described by everyone who knew him as kind, driven, and deeply dedicated. But in the early hours of that April morning, something happened that no one can explain. No trace of Michael McLean has ever been found, and his case remains unsolved. If you have any information about his disappearance, please contact the Nashua Police Department at 603-594-0000. 3500. For 12-year-old Kathleen Kelly, May 22, 1981, was supposed to be a simple, fun day. She planned on spending the afternoon at the Ches Arena, a local skating rink in Cheswick, Pennsylvania, with some of her family. She was there with her older sister, Judy Stanko, and Judy's husband, both of whom worked at the rink and were more than 20 years older than Kathleen. A handful of Kathleen's nieces and nephews came along too, children closer to her age. After a while, she left the rink with Judy and Judy's infant baby. They walked the 8 blocks over to Judy's house and hung out for about an hour, just talking like sisters do. From there, Kathleen's own home was just 6 blocks further, in neighboring Springdale, Pennsylvania. It was a short walk, a path she knew by heart. She said her goodbyes and headed off on her own. But Kathleen never made it back home. Looking back on that day, Kathleen's sister Judy remains haunted by a small detail. She recalled Kathleen being a little distant during their chat, almost evasive. It left Judy with a nagging question. Was Kathleen hiding something? Did she have secret plans to go somewhere other than straight home? Her niece, Kimberly Robertson, was 4 years older, but the two were inseparable, more like sisters than anything. And Kimberly never believed Kathleen was taken by a stranger. She is convinced that Kathleen left on purpose. According to Kimberly, there were serious problems in Kathleen's home life, the kind of troubles a kid doesn't know how to talk about, and running away might have felt like the only way out. The police seemed to agree with her. From the very beginning, they treated Kathleen's case as a runaway, not a missing persons case. With that one simple distinction, any chance of a major search or serious investigation evaporated. The official response wasn't to look for her, but to simply wait for her to come home. So the family waited. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into years. An entire decade went by with nothing new about her disappearance. Then one day the phone rang in Kimberly's house. She answered, and a voice on the other end said just one thing. You know who I am, and I'm fine. Before Kimberly could even speak, the line went dead. It wasn't the only strange call she received. There were others over the years, times she'd pick up the phone to hear nothing but empty silence on the other end. Kimberly would ask, Kathleen, is that you? But the caller would always hang up. Was Kathleen Kelly a girl taken by a stranger, or a young woman who chose to build a new life? For her family, the years of not knowing have been the hardest part. They still hold out hope that she is alive somewhere. Kathleen Kelly is forever frozen in time, just as she was in 1981, a white female, about 5 feet 2 inches tall, weighing around 100 pounds, with brown hair and brown eyes. She was born on February 20th, 1969, and was 12 years old at the time of her disappearance. If she is still alive today, she would be 56 years old. If you have any information regarding the whereabouts or disappearance of Kathleen Kelly, please contact the Allegheny Valley Regional Police Department at 724-274-2843. For a high school sophomore, a first heartbreak can feel like the end of the world. And in December 2003, during his sophomore year of high school in Edison, New Jersey, Daniel Ewan's life began to unravel. After a breakup with his girlfriend, he stopped attending classes, he fell into a deep depression, and his worried parents looked for help anywhere they could find it. Several psychiatrists diagnosed him with depression, offering therapeutic treatments in response until one offered something different. One of them offered what sounded like a lifeline. The CEDU School, a therapeutic boarding school for teens, located in Running Springs, California. On paper, it was a place of hope and healing for troubled teenagers. The reality, however, was a well-hidden nightmare. Former students and staff had accused the school of psychological abuse, dangerous cult-like practices, and manipulation. Daniel didn't need to know the school's history to know something was wrong. Within the first week of arriving, in phone calls to his parents, he told them how unhappy he was. He said he felt threatened by the other students and that the environment wasn't safe. He even admitted he was planning to run away, a pattern he had back home in New Jersey. When things got tough at home, he left. On February 8, 2004, just 10 days after his arrival, Daniel Ewan walked out of the CEDU school at 10:45 in the morning. He told classmates that he was going to buy a pack of cigarettes, but he never came back. He left with no identification, no belongings, and no extra clothing. For the CEDU school, this was almost routine. They had a private investigator named Keith Raymond on retainer, whose main job was tracking down the steady stream of kids who ran away. Raymond was good at his job and usually brought them back. But Daniel was different. For weeks, there was no sign of Daniel. A month later, a promising tip surfaced. Witnesses in San Diego, over 100 miles south, claimed they saw a teen matching Daniel's description panhandling in Hilltop Community Park. Raymond brought in scent tracking dogs, and incredibly, they confirmed it. Daniel's scent was in the park. He had been there. But the trail went cold right at that spot. It was the first and last real lead anyone would have. A year later, the institution that had failed Daniel so spectacularly imploded. Buried under lawsuits from families telling similar stories of mistreatment, the CEDU school declared bankruptcy and shut its doors for good. Daniel's parents were among the many who filed lawsuits, convinced the school's negligence led to their son's disappearance. The school was gone, but for Daniel's family, the questions it created were left unanswered. It was learned that two other boys, John Inman and Blake Pursley, had also vanished from CEDU campuses in the 90s, never to be seen again. Daniel was the third. Years passed. The school was gone, and the trail was ice cold. Then, in December 2018, 14 years after Daniel disappeared, a message came out of the blue. Private investigator Keith Raymond received a voicemail from an unknown number. The voice on the other end said, "Daniel Ewan is fine. Daniel Ewan is still in the same area where you originally searched. He doesn't want to be found. He doesn't want you or his parents looking for him." It was the first new lead in over a decade. Raymond immediately traveled back to San Diego, back to Hilltop Community Park where the scent dogs had hit on Daniel's trail years ago. But this time, he wasn't looking for the 16-year-old boy who ran away. In his hand, he carried an age progression photo, searching for the face of a man in his early 30s. When he showed it to staff at the park office, one employee said the man in the picture looked familiar. She claimed she had seen him that very day, accompanied by a Caucasian woman and a baby girl. It was the most promising lead in 14 years, a clear sign of a new life, a new family. And then, just like before, the trail evaporated. The man, the woman, and the child were gone. Today, Daniel's parents have a simple message for the son who is now a grown man. They want him to know that he is not in any trouble, not with them and not with the law. They don't want to upend his life. They just want to know that he is safe. If you have any information about Daniel Ewan's disappearance, please contact the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department at 909-387-3690. In the fall of 1965, 25-year-old Mary Shotwell Little was at the very beginning of a happy new life. A secretary at the C&S Bank in Atlanta, she had been married for just 6 weeks to a bank examiner named Roy Little. On October 14th, she was busy with preparations. Her husband was due home the next day from an out-of-town training class for work, and Mary was planning a small party to welcome him back. After her shift, she stopped for groceries and then met a coworker for dinner at the Piccadilly Cafeteria in Lenox Square, the hub of Atlanta's upscale Buckhead neighborhood. Over the meal, her friend recalled that Mary was happy. She was talking excitedly about her new marriage. Around 8 p.m., she said her goodbyes and walked out to the parking lot alone. That short walk to her car was the last time anyone is confirmed to have seen her. The next morning, Mary's desk at the bank was empty. When she didn't show up or call in sick, something her boss knew was completely out of character, he made a concerned phone call to the colleague she had dined with, trying to piece together where she could be. The coworker knew exactly where Mary had parked her metallic gray 1965 Mercury Comet. But when Lenox Square security first searched the massive lot, the car wasn't there. Then, in a twist that has never been explained, when Mary's bank supervisor arrived to join the search, the Comet was suddenly sitting right where it was supposed to be, in its spot in the yellow 32 lot. The car was coated in a film of red dust, suggesting it had been driven down a dirt road. But the real story was inside the car. The groceries Mary had bought for her party sat on the seat, alongside some Coke bottles and her brand of Kent cigarettes. But investigators found something else. They discovered her undergarments: a slip, panties, a girdle, a bra, and a single stocking. Most of the items were neatly folded on the center console. The bra and the stocking, however, were on the floor. A closer look revealed the stocking had been deliberately cut, possibly with a knife. The clothes were confirmed to be Mary's and had been worn recently. Just as telling was what was missing. Her coat, her dress, her purse, and her keys were all gone. They have never been recovered. The scene in the car grew even darker with the discovery of blood, specks on the undergarments and smears across the seats, steering wheel, and door. But to investigators, something felt wrong. The blood seemed performative, smeared too deliberately, as if to create the impression of a violent struggle. It felt staged. While the car pointed to a crime in Atlanta, a different trail was already appearing hundreds of miles away. In the early morning hours of October 15th, Mary's credit card was used in her hometown of Charlotte, North Carolina. 12 hours later, it was used again in Raleigh. The time gap made no sense. A drive that should have taken 3 hours had somehow stretched to a full day. Witnesses from the gas stations provided a disturbing picture. They recalled a woman who looked like Mary traveling with one or two rough, middle-aged men who directed her every move. Strangely, the woman seemed to be hiding her face and never tried to ask for help. This led police to suspect the entire trip was a performance, a misdirection to pull the search away from Atlanta. But one detail defied every theory. The credit card slips were signed Mrs. Roy H. Little Jr. in what looked like Mary's own handwriting. Back in Atlanta, her car's odometer revealed another contradiction. 41 miles of driving that couldn't be accounted for. A short local trip that had nothing to do with a long journey to North Carolina. In the weeks before she vanished, friends noticed Mary Little was living with a growing sense of fear. She had been receiving strange, unsettling phone calls at work from an unknown person. She hinted that her new marriage meant she couldn't meet this person anymore, but cryptically added that they were still welcome to visit her. Around the same time, bouquets of flowers from a secret admirer began arriving. Her anxiety became obvious. She grew fearful of being home alone or driving her car by herself. A few days before she disappeared, Mary told her coworkers she had something important to tell them, but she never got the chance. After she was gone, the case was buried in more confusion. A $20,000 ransom demand led an FBI agent to a forest overpass only to find a blank piece of paper. The call was dismissed as a hoax. Her husband, Roy, was briefly investigated due to his seemingly cold reaction and refusal to take a polygraph, but he had a firm alibi and was cleared of any involvement. Years later, the official police file on the case mysteriously went missing. With so many bizarre clues, from her own signature on the credit card slips to the stolen license plate on her car, some investigators came to believe Mary staged her own disappearance. Others are certain she was abducted, pointing to a report of another woman being confronted by a man in that same parking lot just moments before Mary disappeared. Was she a victim of a random attack, or was she running from a secret life her new husband never knew? 60 years later, the mystery is still unsolved. Anyone with information is urged to contact the Atlanta Police Department at 404-853-3434. December in rural Ontario isn't exactly known for the unexpected. And in Moffat, Ontario, 1996 was ending like most years did there. Calm, nothing out of the ordinary. For 42-year-old Wayne Grivette, those final weeks of 1996 were supposed to be the start of something new. He'd spent his adult life in the beverage industry, not just working the business, but learning it. The machinery, the distribution, the logistics of moving liquids from point A to point B. It was his chosen trade, his expertise. But by late 1996, Wayne was ready to take what he knew and put it to work for himself. He began building a small spring water operation on the family farm. Something humble, something local, something he could grow on his own terms. And it was working. Things were looking good, right up until December 12th, 1996. That morning, a package showed up on the Grivette doorstep. Wayne's son, 21-year-old Justin, brought it inside along with the rest of the day's mail. It looked like a gift, wrapped in white paper, trimmed in dark green, tied neatly with a ribbon. It also looked like someone had taken their time with it. Wayne's wife, Diane, and Justin were in the living room when Wayne finally sat down with it. There wasn't any hesitation, no suspicion, just another package to open on a Thursday in December. Wayne untied the ribbon, peeled back the wrapping paper, and lifted the lid. Inside was a wine box, domain door. Not a bottle, just the box. The barcode and UPC had been cut out of the cardboard. Not in a sloppy way. It looked deliberate. Someone had removed the only piece of the box that could ever trace back to a store, a distributor, even a shelf. Anything with a paper trail. The rest of the package was totally ordinary, and sitting on top of folded-up local newspaper flyers that were used as packing material was a heavy gray Duracell floating lantern. Justin grabbed it first. He tried to flick the switch, but nothing happened. He twisted the casing, but again, nothing happened. The plastic didn't move, didn't bend, it didn't give even a little bit. Justin passed it off to his dad. Wayne was on the couch, glasses on, skimming a business proposal someone named William J. French had sent along with the package. The letter talked about a new venture, something called Acton Home Products. It name-dropped two people named Lisa and Joe, old industry colleagues that Wayne actually knew. Reading it, you could almost hear the tone the sender was going for. Reassuring, friendly, even a little flattering. Like it was written to lower the reader's guard just enough to stop asking questions. And it worked, because while he was reading the document, Wayne casually pressed the lantern's button with his thumb, not expecting anything more than the lamp to turn on. But that didn't happen. Instead, there was a blast. In the seconds that followed, the Grivet house was no longer a home. It became a crime scene. Investigators would later confirm what was obvious to everyone by then. The lantern wasn't sealed shut by glue. It was sealed shut because it wasn't a lantern anymore. It had been rebuilt from the inside out. The lantern had been hollowed out, refitted, and reconstructed into an improvised explosive device. The trigger was a single AA battery. The payload included more than a pound of superfrac, a mining explosive that, shockingly, could still be bought off the shelf without a license well into the late 1970s. The casing wasn't just packed with explosive. It was also packed with roofing nails. Hundreds of them, meant to do the most damage possible. Wayne never had a chance. There was no time to stand, no time to shout, no time to understand what was happening. The explosion killed him almost instantly. Diane and Justin survived, but barely, by literal inches. One moment they were sitting beside their husband and father, everything as normal as ever. The next, they were thrown into an explosion of noise and debris. Ears ringing, skin stinging, bodies hit with shrapnel, dust, splintered wood, and fragments of drywall and glass falling around. Detectives on the case quickly jumped on details found in the letter, the first big clue left at the scene. The man in the letter, William J. French, wasn't a real person, and the company he claimed to represent, Acton Home Products, was also not real. The return address was a fake, too. The entire letter and business proposal was pure fiction. And yet, whoever wrote the letter knew Wayne better than they should have. They knew he'd recently moved. They knew he'd left Acton. They knew he was now living in Moffett. Remember, this was in 1996, and that's not the kind of detail you could get easily. But it got even stranger. Detectives would discover that just weeks before the explosion that killed Wayne Grivet, two men had been seen at the Acton post office asking for the Grivet's new address. It wasn't a coincidence anyone could ignore. Someone was looking for him. Someone was making sure they could still reach him. From inside the package itself, investigators recovered a circular for Copeland Lumber, a flyer that was only distributed in the Milton area. Not Toronto, not Ottawa, not somewhere in Ontario. Milton, only 12 miles away from Moffett. And the letter itself gave them something else too. Not a name, not a motive, but a fingerprint. Kind of. Detectives found that it had been typed on a Smith Corona electric typewriter using a script 10/12 daisy wheel. Most people, including me, wouldn't know what that even means. But forensic analysts did. And because one arm on that typing wheel was bent, every single period printed slightly crooked. It was a small defect, a manufacturing flaw, but it was a consistent one and uniquely identifiable to that specific typewriter. Investigators even recovered 2 strands of hair from the wreckage that did not match any of the Grivet family. But there were no roots left on the hair. No roots meant no nuclear DNA. No nuclear DNA meant no full profile. Whatever biological lead they had stopped there. As the physical evidence ran dry, detectives did what detectives always do. They rewound the tape and looked at the past. The strongest theory they came up with was centered around a man by the name of Ed Gallick, Wayne's former business partner. They'd had a bitter split years earlier. Accusations, resentment, rumors of stolen business ideas, a friendship that ended badly. But even with all that tension, investigators could never answer the real question. How does someone go from bad blood in business to building a bomb that looks like a Christmas gift? Besides, there was no evidence linking Gallick to the package, the typewriter, the explosives, or the search at the post office. No matter how hard they pulled on that thread, it never connected to murder. And then there was the letter's final line, the only moment where the tone slipped. The postscript read, "Didn't realize you had moved. Had some trouble finding you. Have a very Merry Christmas, and may you never have to buy another flashlight." It was cold, personal, and unnecessary. It's the kind of sentence someone writes when they want to be remembered, And for more than 30 years, that line has been something no one can shake. Not the explosives, not the typewriter, not the fake name. Instead, it's the voice behind it. The brief moment where the mask truly dropped. Somebody planned it. Somebody built it. Somebody mailed it. And that somebody, or somebodies, is still out there. A murderer. A cold-blooded killer that's known only by a missing barcode and a crooked typewriter. If you have any information that could help solve the murder of Wayne Grivet, please contact your closest Royal Canadian Mounted Police location. In June of 1974, 14-year-old Margaret Ellen Fox, Maggie to everyone who knew her, was getting ready to start summer in her hometown of Burlington, New Jersey. Maggie wasn't looking to lay around all summer. She wanted to start working and was ready to start making her own money. So she put a babysitting ad in the local paper. Something simple and direct. Babysitter available. And shortly after the ad was run in the paper, a man calling himself John Marshall called Maggie, saying that he needed someone to watch his kids the following weekend. But after making the initial plans to babysit and meet for an initial interview, John continued calling Maggie's house, over and over again. He kept changing details about the job at first, and then he began changing the time and place of the interview. Still, this was Maggie's first real job, so she stayed polite and professional. Eventually, a meeting was set for June 24, 1974, but he didn't invite Maggie to his home and told her that he wouldn't be able to come to hers. Instead, he told her to meet him at a local park in the nearby town of Mount Holly, New Jersey, about a 15-minute bus ride away. He told her to look for a red Volkswagen when she arrived. That morning, Maggie's younger brother walked her to the bus stop and watched her board the 541 bus, heading toward Mount Holly. When dinner came and went without Maggie returning home, her parents began a frantic search for her. By nightfall, Burlington City Police and the FBI were involved. Realizing the potential for a kidnapping, investigators took the immediate precaution of installing a recording device on the Fox family's telephone. And they didn't have to wait long before the phone rang, and the voice on the other end confirmed their worst fears.
$10,000 might be a lot of bread, but your daughter's life is the buttered topping.
Who is it?
The voice was calm. There was no panic in his voice, no urgency, no emotion at all. He said it like it was nothing. 10,000 might be a lot of bread, but your daughter's life is the buttered topping. That one sentence, spoken to Maggie's mother, would become one of the most analyzed pieces of criminal audio in the state's history. That line told them something about the person on the other end of the line. He wasn't just asking for money. He was letting them know that he was in control. When they traced the number John Marshall gave Maggie, it led them to a public payphone at a grocery store in Lumberton, New Jersey, just a few miles from where she was last seen. Once the story hit the news, more families spoke up about similar experiences with a man calling teenage girls about jobs that didn't really exist. He wasn't impulsive. He was methodical. He seemed to comb through the help-wanted ads, making calls over and over until one day he found a girl that said yes. But the case quickly went quiet. And as the decades passed and tips dried up, files were archived. Maggie Fox would be in her 60s now, and her story is still unresolved to this day. The FBI is offering a reward of $25,000 for information leading to an arrest. If you have any information concerning the disappearance of Margaret Ellen Fox, or can identify the voice in the recording, please contact your local FBI office. April 20th, 1990 was a Friday that started like any other in Eagan, Minnesota. 17-year-old Christopher Kurz told his parents he didn't feel well and he was going to stay home from school and sleep. It was a request his parents didn't think twice about as they headed out to work. They trusted him. But when they came home that evening, the driveway told a different story. Their 1988 Dodge Caravan was gone. Inside, the house was dark and quiet. Christopher wasn't home, but there was a handwritten note from him on the kitchen counter. It said something had come up and he'd be back by 6 p.m., but there was one line in particular that didn't sit right. Unless I get lost. The word lost was underlined, twice. 6 p.m. passed, then the next day passed. The day after that, another note arrived in the mail. This one from Duluth, 150 miles north. It was Christopher, and in the note he admitted he wasn't actually sick. He just wanted to use the van. He said he was going somewhere but couldn't explain where, and apologized for what he planned to do. This time the message was painfully clear. Christopher didn't plan on coming back home. When his parents checked the house, they found something else was missing. His father's 20-gauge Mossberg shotgun. But no ammunition was taken, not a single shell, which left investigators wondering. If he planned to hurt himself, why bring a gun but no bullets? And if he didn't plan to use it, why take it at all? 2 days later, the van turned up abandoned. It was found parked on a logging road near Grand Rapids, almost 200 miles from home. Police didn't find any blood, no signs of an injury, and no weapons were found inside the van. But they didn't find Christopher either. He had stepped out of the van, into the woods, and seemingly disappeared. Then came the phone call. A week after he vanished, his parents picked up the phone and heard a roar of noise. Muffled music, voices, and laughter. It sounded like people. Lots of people. But when Christopher's parents pleaded for the person on the other end of the phone to speak, the line dropped. Christopher's best friend and neighbor started receiving the exact same type of calls. No voice, just the sound of music, laughter, and a lot of people. Christopher's mother remains convinced to this day that it was her son on the other end of the line. After 6 months of these calls, they stopped as abruptly as they had started. In 1993, the search for Christopher went national. Christopher's face appeared in the Runaway Train music video by Soul Asylum, a video that helped bring other missing kids home. But for Christopher's family, there were no updates and no verified sightings of him. The case took another bizarre turn in 2004 when the Eagan police received an anonymous letter. The writer told the police to stop looking for Christopher, claiming he would come back when he is ready. It sounded oddly personal and almost convincing. Almost. After a long investigation, authorities concluded the letter was likely a cruel hoax. After the Jacob Wetterling case was finally solved in Minnesota in 2016, local police reopened Christopher's file. They used age progression software to show what he might look like now. And the detective leading the case today still says the same thing every investigator before her eventually had to say. As of now, they don't know what happened to him, but they haven't stopped trying to find out. In the note Christopher left his parents on April 20th, 1990, he predicted he would come back home unless he got lost. He even underlined the word, twice. 35 years later, Christopher is still a missing person. If you have any information regarding the disappearance of Christopher Kurz, you are urged to contact the City of Eagan Police Department at 651-675-5700. Physical evidence is the backbone of any investigation. A fingerprint puts a suspect in the room. A drop of blood establishes a timeline. A murder weapon tells you exactly how a life was taken. But the most terrifying piece of evidence an investigator can find isn't something left behind by accident. Instead, it's a message, written and left entirely on purpose. On this episode, we're looking at 3 cold cases defined by the chilling, cryptic, and impossible-to-ignore notes left at the scene. We'll start with the kidnapping of a Mississippi millionaire's wife, where the only proof of life was a blood-stained letter claiming she was being held inside a basement. We'll examine the execution of an Arizona escrow agent found dead in the desert, hiding a coded $2 bill and a cryptic Bible verse pinned inside his clothing. We'll look at the brutal murder of a Texas priest, a case that includes a stranger who walked into a church hundreds of miles away, swallowed a capsule of cyanide in a confessional booth, and left behind a fake name. These messages are the final words of the desperate, the doomed, and the incredibly dangerous. And decades later, we're still trying to figure out exactly what they mean. "72-year-old Annie Laurie Heron lived in the upscale Woodland Hills neighborhood of Jackson, Mississippi, with her husband Robert Heron Sr. He was a prominent local businessman and easily one of the wealthiest men in the state during the 1980s, and Annie was also well known around town for her charity work. But behind closed doors, Annie suffered from severe chronic health problems, including an intestinal illness that required her to take medication every single day just to stay out of the hospital, keeping her home most of the time. It was July 26, 1988, and Annie was having a totally normal day hosting her regular bridge club luncheon. Her friends eventually packed up and left, and by around 3 o'clock, her housekeeper finished for the day, leaving her alone in the house. Fast forward an hour and a half, and Robert arrived home at approximately 4:30. Annie's car was parked in the driveway, so when he walked inside, he was fully expecting to see his wife. But instead, the house was completely empty. Normally, he would have just thought that she had stepped out to run a quick errand with their daughter Lori, but her purse was still sitting there. Her shoes were still there, and so were her eyeglasses and her life-saving medication. By 7:30, he was getting worried, so he called his daughter to see if his wife was with her, at her house. But when he called, Lori's husband, Michael, answered and told Robert Lori was actually out of town. Robert asked Michael to come over right away to help him look for Annie. They called more family and friends, but no one knew where she was. Finally, at 9:50, Robert called the police to report her missing. Then they made an unsettling discovery on the floor in the foyer. Lying by the front door was a folded typewritten note. Robert Heron, put these people back in the shape they was in before they got mixed up with school pictures. Pay them whatever damages they want and tell them all this so they can know what you are doing, but don't tell them why you are doing it. Do this before 10 days pass. Don't call police. It then listed the names of 12 men: Carl Seward, Arnold Belknap, Victor Hanadol, Carl Patton, Herman Stutz, Hal Warner, Jim Combs, Vincent Price, N. Alfred Wynne, George Meacher, Paige Bruton, and Jerry Maroon. The note ended with, "If any is dead, pay his children." When Jackson police arrived, the gravity of the situation really sunk in. Investigators found drops of blood staining the carpet and red smears across the front door and the doorframe. Testing would later confirm the blood matched Annie's blood type. Based on the blood drops and streaks, investigators believed Annie had been struck on the head and forcibly dragged from her own house. Police began knocking on doors, asking neighbors if they had seen anything, and they quickly learned that on the day of Annie's disappearance, neighbors had spotted 2 suspicious vehicles in the area. One was a light-colored Ford pickup truck, and the other was a white cargo van with Florida license plates. Oddly, that same white van had been seen driving around the neighborhood a week earlier. The FBI was brought in to assist, and they immediately zeroed in on the ransom note. They determined it was typed on a vintage Royal typewriter manufactured between 1912 and 1927. The paper was wiped clean. Not a single fingerprint was found. According to the FBI, the kidnapper's demands were incredibly unusual. Instead of a set dollar amount, the kidnapper wanted Robert Sr. to pay damages to 12 specific individuals who had allegedly been wronged by one of Robert's companies, School Pictures of Mississippi Incorporated. Robert had a reputation as a ruthless, no-nonsense businessman. When he took over School Pictures, the company was floundering, and to save it, he slashed costs and aggressively went after debts. Between 1981 and 1983, the company filed lawsuits against 12 franchise owners across 8 different states to collect on operating loans and film processing fees. The 12 names on the kidnappers list were the exact same 12 men Robert had sued. Because those lawsuits were filed in county court, the names were a matter of public record. Police knew this meant the kidnapper didn't have to be one of the 12 men. It could be someone else entirely, using the company as a bizarre diversion. But an FBI forensic psychiatrist studying the note didn't think so. The profiler theorized that the deliberate misspellings in the antique typewriter were calculated, deliberate decisions by the kidnapper. They believed the kidnapper was a paranoid, middle-aged white man acting alone, driven entirely by a thirst for revenge against Robert. The kidnapping didn't follow any of the predictable rules. There were no follow-up phone calls, no specific dollar amounts demanded, and no instructions for a money drop. On August 7th, 12 days after Annie was kidnapped, Robert held a press conference at his home. He made a direct emotional plea into the cameras. Like any businessman, I've made decisions which may appear to others as unfeeling, but those appearances are just not true. Moreover, those business decisions were mine, not my wife's. She had absolutely nothing to do with them. My children and I appeal to whomever has my wife that she may be safely returned to us. 8 days later, on August 15th, Robert received a letter in the mail. It was postmarked from Atlanta, Georgia, on August 12th, but dated August 10th. When Robert looked at the envelope, he immediately recognized the handwriting. It was Annie's. And on the outside of the envelope, there was a single spot of blood. The FBI confirmed the handwriting belonged to his wife. Inside, the terrifying message read, "Bob, if you don't do what these people want you to do, they are going to seal me up in the cellar of this house with only a few jugs of water. Please save me. Signed, Annie Laurie." For the family, the letter was a double-edged sword. It meant that Annie had survived the initial violent struggle at the house. She was alive. at least as of August 10th. But she was trapped, terrified, and the kidnapper's demands were still maddeningly vague. Desperate to show he was making a good faith effort to comply with the kidnapper's demands, Robert took drastic action. He instructed his attorneys to dig through the old school pictures files and calculate exactly how much money the company had originally sued those 12 men for. On August 16th, he mailed out checks totaling nearly $1 million to the men on the list. But the gesture didn't bring Annie home. In fact, at least half of those checks were sent right back by men who were completely confused by the sudden payout. Meanwhile, the FBI was hunting down the source of Annie's terrifying letter. They traced the Atlanta mailing back to a woman named Marilyn Taylor. When they brought her in, Taylor admitted that she had been paid $500 by her former boyfriend to travel to Atlanta under an assumed name, just to drop that letter in a mailbox. That former boyfriend was a Florida attorney named Newton Alfred Wynn, and his name had actually appeared on the original ransom note left in the Heron's foyer. Suddenly, the pieces started falling into place. Investigators learned Wynn had rented a white van right around the time of the abduction, which perfectly matched witness reports of a white van seen creeping around Annie's neighborhood. When authorities searched Wynn's office, they found maps of Jackson with the Heron neighborhood marked, plus a royal typewriter consistent with the style used in the ransom note. It looked incredibly damning, but the connection was circumstantial. Nevertheless, in 1990, Wynn was convicted of extortion, perjury, and conspiracy related to the kidnapping plot. He was sentenced to nearly 20 years in federal prison, but he was never convicted of murder. Annie Heron's body was never recovered, and Wynn maintained his innocence until his death in 2012. Robert Heron died in 1990, before his wife's fate was ever resolved. Annie was later legally declared dead, and to this day, her remains have never been found. What started as a strange ransom demand evolved into one of Mississippi's most baffling disappearances. It became a story of extreme wealth, bitter revenge, and a chilling letter. And despite the conviction, the prison time, and decades of investigation, we are still left with one haunting question. What really happened to Annie Laurie Heron? In 1977, Arizona was dealing with a massive surge in organized crime. The state was seeing an influx of fraud and suspected money laundering schemes, and the city of Tucson was no exception. Enter Charles Chuck Morgan. He was a 39-year-old escrow agent living in Tucson with his wife Ruth and their daughters. On paper, he was just a regular guy and family man. But on March 22, 1977, after dropping his children off at school, Charles disappeared. Several days later, he returned home, but he was in a deeply disturbing state. He was missing one of his shoes. His wrists had been bound together with plastic restraints, and there was a broken plastic cuff dangling from his ankle. He appeared to be legitimately terrified, and he initially refused to speak. Instead, he communicated with his wife in writing, claiming that he had been kidnapped. He wrote that his captors had drugged him, and he explicitly warned Ruth not to contact the police, writing that their family would be harmed if she did. It's important to point out that there was no independent evidence confirming Chuck's story. The entire account of what happened during those missing days are based solely on his statements to his family. After the incident, and in the weeks that followed, Charles began telling relatives that he was involved in undercover work connected to federal investigations into organized crime. The federal authorities, for the record, would later completely deny that he ever worked for them. Charles became more and more paranoid. He started wearing a bulletproof vest on a regular basis, and he reportedly told his father that if anything happened to him, he had left behind an explanation. Then, on June 7, 1977, Charles Morgan disappeared again. 9 days later, his body was found out in the desert outside of Tucson. He was still wearing his bulletproof vest. He had been shot once in the back of the head with his own .357 Magnum revolver. Because gunshot residue was reportedly found on his hand, investigators officially ruled his death as self-inflicted. But several incredibly bizarre details complicated that decision. When investigators searched Charles, they found a $2 bill pinned inside his underwear. The bill was covered in handwritten notes. The writing referenced a Bible passage, Ecclesiastes 12, verses 1 through 8. According to his family, a mysterious woman had called Ruth while Charles was missing and quoted the exact same Bible passage. The bill also contained several names, numbers, and what appeared to be a crude map referencing highways and border areas south of Tucson. Interpretations of what this map meant vary wildly, and no definitive explanation has ever been confirmed. Inside Charles's car, police found handwritten directions leading straight to the desert location where his body was discovered. Also found inside the vehicle was a tooth, wrapped neatly in a piece of cloth. The significance of that tooth has never been publicly explained, and the strangeness continued even after his death. 2 weeks later, Ruth stated that men identifying themselves as federal agents arrived at their home, searched it, and removed boxes of documents. To this day, there is no publicly available confirmation that these men were actually with the FBI. Officially, the death of Charles Morgan remains classified as self-inflicted. But whether those strange notes and coded markings were the tragic result of severe paranoia, the desperate breadcrumbs of secret illegal dealings, or something else entirely, remains completely unresolved. On the morning of December 21st, 1981, a maid at the Sand and Sage Motel in Odessa, Texas, unlocked the door to room 126. What she found inside was a scene of absolute chaos. The room was in complete disarray, with the mattress having been pulled entirely off the bed, the furniture badly damaged, and there was blood all over the room. Lying on the floor was the body of a 49-year-old man. He had been brutally beaten to death, and his hands were bound behind his back. Because the man had checked into the motel under an alias, it took authorities a while to figure out who he was. But when they finally did, the news completely stunned the community. The victim wasn't some drifter. He was Father Patrick Ryan, a Catholic priest from a parish roughly 90 miles away. Investigators needed a suspect, and they soon focused on a 23-year-old Apache man named James Reyes. James had been hitchhiking and actually received a ride from Father Ryan the day before the murder. But the real turning point for the police came in 1982. While heavily intoxicated, James called the police and made a series of incriminating statements. The very next day, after sobering up, he completely recanted. James maintained his innocence, explaining that he had traveled to New Mexico right around the time of the killing. But prosecutors argued that the timeline still theoretically allowed him to commit the crime before leaving Texas. And it worked. In 1983, James Reyes was convicted and sentenced to 38 years in prison. For decades, it looked like the case was closed. But just 1 year after Father Ryan's death, an incredibly strange incident occurred hundreds of miles away in Boise, Idaho. On December 4th, 1982, an unidentified man walked into the Sacred Heart Catholic Church and stepped inside a confessional booth. There he swallowed a lethal dose of cyanide and died shortly afterward. When police searched his body, he carried absolutely no identification. But he did have an envelope. Inside was a stack of cash and a typewritten note requesting his cremation. The note was signed William L. Toomey, which happened to be the name of a well-known manufacturer of Catholic clerical clothing. For years, investigators and true crime researchers speculated that there was a dark connection between this and Father Ryan's murder. But the truth is, no definitive link was ever established. The Toomey note just sat there as an unsolved footnote to the Father Ryan case, until 2022. That year, the Odessa Police Department reopened the investigation. Digging through the archives, they located previously unsubmitted fingerprint evidence that had been collected from the motel room and Father Ryan's belongings. When they ran those prints through modern databases, they didn't match James Reyes. Instead, they matched several local men with criminal histories. Men who actually had connections to the Sand and Sage Motel at the exact time of the murder. Investigators now believe the killing wasn't a sprawling conspiracy, but a brutal robbery involving local suspects. The murder case is now officially open again. In October 2023, after serving 20 years in prison, James Reyes was officially and fully exonerated. As for the man in the Boise confessional, his identity is still unknown. His fingerprints have never been linked to Father Ryan's murder. Who he really was, and why he chose to die in a church under the name William L. Toomey, remains a complete mystery. But thanks to modern forensic testing, we do know one thing for sure. The death of Father Patrick Ryan is no longer tied to the wrong man.
Throughout history, there exist tragedies and mysteries that transcend events, leaving marks on our collective memory. These stories are not just about their profound impact on friends, family, and loved ones, but also society, as the inexplicable circumstances that surround them bring with them intrigue and disbelief. From haunting messages left in remote places to cell phones ringing incessantly from the wreckage long after their owners have passed, each mystery offers both hope and heartache to those left behind. These stories reveal more than the tragedies themselves. They unveil the human spirit tested to its limits, struggling against nature, fate, and the relentless march of time. Regardless of the outcomes, they speak of resilience where loved ones cling to faint signals, refusing to surrender to despair. Each story a reminder of our capacity for hope amidst the darkest of circumstances. Welcome back to Fireside Unsolved, Episode 87, Mysterious Messages Left Behind. At approximately 6:30 p.m. on Tuesday, August 7, 1973, Darlene Ross of Fontana, California, was listening to her CB radio when she intercepted a distressing signal. A young boy's voice broke through the static and pleaded for help, exclaiming, "Help! Please help me!" Responding quickly, Darlene attempted to calm the boy down, while also trying to gather more information. He responded that his father had died, and then urgently called out, "Come on, David, help me." The boy, identifying himself as Larry, mentioned being in New Mexico just before his signal was lost. As a former resident of Albuquerque, Darlene Ross swiftly notified New Mexico authorities of the situation. And then, later that night, she reached out to the Albuquerque Journal, which published the story of Larry's distress call in the next day's edition. Reports of the distress calls began flooding in from all over the southwest United States. From as far west as Long Beach, California, various CB radio users, including a professional truck driver, had heard Larry's radio call. Typically, CB transceivers of that era could not broadcast signals far beyond the operator's state. However, the weather conditions that week created an ionospheric skip, which allowed Larry's signal to reach far outside his reported location of New Mexico. Remarkably, the signal reached as far east as Mississippi that day, and soon after, it extended north to Canada. Also on the same day, another CB enthusiast, a woman by the name of Linda King, known by her handle Blue Eyes, managed to encourage Larry to share more details about his situation. Larry reiterated that his father had died and added that he was trapped inside the cab of an overturned pickup truck next to his father's body, with no food or water. He mentioned that he was 6 years old and did not know how to properly use the truck's CB radio, which would explain the signal being heard on multiple channels. As reports of Larry's signal spread to the rest of the United States, 3 separate search and rescue operation teams began mobilizing in New Mexico: the New Mexico State Police, the New Mexico Wing Civil Air Patrol, and the Albuquerque Citizens Radio Association. Clark Speakman of Albuquerque Citizens Radio Association suggested that Larry was likely in southern New Mexico based on radio conversations locals had with him. The Civil Air Patrol deployed several planes equipped with radio direction finders over southern New Mexico and southeastern Arizona, while the state police initiated a ground search in the Sandia Mountains foothills southeast of Albuquerque. The story gained traction when United Press International reported it, highlighting the possibility of it being a hoax, while also noting that Larry seemed unfamiliar with his surroundings and was nearly incoherent at times. Radio operators in the broader Albuquerque area reported that Larry's signal might have originated south of a cement factory in Tijeras Canyon, and searchers converged on this location. Despite these efforts, when the searchers reached the cement factory, all they found were abandoned trucks, cars, and various debris. A helicopter dispatched to investigate an abandoned truck east of the Manzano Mountains also found nothing. As night fell, Larry reported rain at his location, and 4th of July Canyon in the Manzano Mountains was the only location that had rain in the area. Linda King asked Larry to yell into his microphone when he spotted the landing lights of a Las Cruces Civil Air Patrol Piper Cherokee flying overhead the canyon. But again, no results. By Wednesday evening, 150 people equipped with directional finders and radio monitors were searching central New Mexico for Larry's signal. As Thursday ended, critical phone lines at the state police offices were overwhelmed with calls, including reports from families worried about their own missing children named Larry, all of whom were later found safe. Friday, August 10th began with conflicting reports about Larry's signal weakening, suggesting his CB radio batteries were dying. Then, an interesting report came into authorities from a Phoenix CB operator named Frank Laughlin. If you remember in the beginning of this story, Larry was heard saying, "Come on, David, help me." Well, Frank reported a boy named David was claiming to be outside the overturned truck. By Sunday, August 12th, the state police were able to rule out several transmissions as hoaxes, including the voice of David, who was discovered to be a boy in Phoenix playing on his walkie-talkie. 5 days into the operation, searchers had to accept the grim possibility that Larry might have died from exposure or dehydration, should his initial broadcast have been a legitimate cry for help. With all leads exhausted, the search was called off Sunday night. 4 directional finders were left operating in central New Mexico over the following weeks, which would allow his location to be more easily pinpointed if Larry were to broadcast again. On Saturday, August 24, 1973, CB operators in Colorado picked up the voice of a man who claimed to be responsible for the Larry signals. The man boasted about hoaxing the New Mexico State Police over CB radio. Just before midnight, after service station operator Robert Vetter of Denver intervened, the man made several death threats against Vetter and other political figures before his transmission ceased, preventing operators from tracing his location. The death threats were submitted to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which then passed them to the Federal Communications Commission and the Secret Service for further investigation. Vetter, who had heard the Larry signals earlier in the month, cast doubt on the man's claim of being responsible for those signals. He remarked, "I don't think it was the same person. The voice of the man that made the threat had a Mexican accent, but the other one didn't. I'm not really worried about it. We're getting all the nuts out of the woodwork now." The Larry incident contributed to the FCC establishing regional CB investigation teams in 1974 to address misuse of CB radio. The search efforts also led to the formation of the New Mexico Search and Rescue Council in 1974, reflecting the lasting impact on local emergency response coordination. Madge Hara of Albuquerque Journal magazine reflected in 1983 that while Larry was never found, the legacy of the search continued to inspire search and rescue volunteers, underscoring the importance of their dedication in saving lives, regardless if it was a hoax or not. The afternoon of July 24, 1989, 2 men from Tokyo went missing while mountaineering on the trail from Mount Kurodake to Mount Asahidake in Daisetsuzan National Park. The Hokkaido police conducting an aerial search discovered a large SOS sign. The 2 missing men were soon found and safely rescued approximately 2.5 kilometers north of the SOS sign. The Hokkaido police initially believed that the SOS letters made of wood had been constructed by the 2 rescued individuals. However, after their rescue, the men were unaware of the SOS sign's existence. Suspecting another victim, the police resumed their search by helicopter the next day. This search led to the discovery of human bone fragments bearing signs of animal bites, with some bones appearing to have been broken while the person was still alive. Near the SOS sign, the police found a hole just large enough to fit a human body, containing 4 cassette tapes, a tape recorder, a backpack, amulets, a human skull, a tripod, a pair of men's basketball shoes, 2 cameras, a notebook, and the driver's license of Kenji Iwamura. Iwamura, a 25-year-old office worker from Konan, Aichi Prefecture, had gone missing on July 10, 1984, after setting out to hike Asahidake. When Iwamura failed to return to work a week later, his parents requested a police search, but no trace of him was found at the time. The bones were sent to Asahikawa Medical University, where they were identified as those of a woman aged between 20 to 40 years. Initially, investigators believed that there were 2 men and a woman missing in the park, as the skeleton was identified as female. However, no record of a missing woman in Asahidake existed, and Iwamura was reported to have gone alone into the mountains. The police played the recordings found on the cassette tapes, and one of the tapes featured a young man's voice shouting for help for 2 minutes and 17 seconds. The translation of his plea is as follows: "Help me. The place is where I first met the helicopter. The Sasa is deep and you can't go up. Lift me up from here." The purpose of the SOS tape recording remains unknown, but it is speculated that the man on the recording, who was stuck, may have recorded it in the hope that a search team would hear it before he became too debilitated to speak. Another possibility is that the tape recorder was accidentally switched on while the man was yelling for help. Many have speculated that the man shouting was Iwamura, but when his parents were asked about the recording, they could not confirm that the voice belonged to their son. The remaining tapes contained music from different anime TV shows. The SOS sign was investigated by the Japan Forestry Agency and the Japan Geographical Authority, and after a review of previous topographic map data and aerial photographs, they confirmed that the SOS sign was visible in images taken as far back as September 20th, 1987. The wooden letters of the SOS sign were constructed by stacking large, fallen birch trees, and it was estimated that creating such a giant sign would have taken about 2 days and considerable effort. Investigators speculated that the sign was made by the missing person whose skeleton was found and believed to be Iwamura. However, the autopsy described the body as thin and weak, suggesting it would have been impossible for him to make the sign on his own. Additionally, no axe or tool that could have been used to cut down the trees was found at the site. An acquaintance of Kenji Iwamura testified that Iwamura had been carrying a recording of anime theme songs on a tape and wore the same size basketball shoes found during the search. To this day, the SOS incident is still unsolved. It was on April 4, 2001, that Jean Larson, a paragliding enthusiast from New Zealand, disappeared after taking off from Mystic Point, Australia, a renowned spot for paragliders. Jean had been enjoying the sport with a group, including a doctor, who later became alarmed when Jean did not return to their meeting point as expected. The doctor, who had been paragliding with Larson, reported hearing distressing sounds over the radio later that night. He described hearing a voice and moaning, which he believed belonged to his injured friend, Jean Larson. This prompted immediate concern as it suggested that Larson might be stranded or hurt somewhere in the rugged terrain. Inspector Neil Fursden, the acting police chief at the time, expressed his deep concern about the situation. He emphasized the gravity of the circumstances, noting that the most troubling aspect was the possibility that Jean Larson was out there, waiting to be found. The search efforts intensified as Fursden and his team made repeated attempts to communicate with Larson over the radio. The rescue teams faced a challenging task, navigating the difficult and potentially dangerous landscape around Mystic Point. The continued affirmation over the radio that it was indeed Jean Larson responding gave the search teams a glimmer of hope, but also underscored the dire need to locate him quickly. As night fell, the search continued and the responses over the radio became more telling. Clicks indicated that the person on the other end could see power lines and was injured. Initially focusing on a compact, 1 square kilometer area of rugged terrain, the search eventually expanded to cover an 80 square kilometer region as hopes of finding Larson alive dwindled. On April 10, 2001, tragedy struck when the body of 34-year-old Jean Larson was discovered in dense bushland, approximately 16 kilometers away from the original search area. The extensive search effort involved over 250 people, underscoring the community's commitment to finding Larson. Upon recovering Larson's body, authorities concluded that it would have been impossible for him to have made the radio calls, indicating that he died upon impact with the ground. Inspector Fursden confirmed that when Larson's body was found, his radio was nearby, tuned to a completely different channel than the one used during the search efforts. This revelation added mystery to the tragic incident, leaving lingering questions about what exactly transpired during Larson's final moments in the Australian wilderness. The unimaginable happened in California's San Fernando Valley, when a commuter train carrying 225 passengers collided with a freight train on September 12, 2008, resulting in what became known as the Chatsworth Crash. Among the 25 lives lost was 49-year-old Charles E. Peck, a customer service agent at Delta Airlines based in Salt Lake City. Peck's trip to Los Angeles was for a significant reason. He had come for a job interview at Van Nuys Airport, hoping to secure employment in California so he could be closer to his fiancée. The couple had postponed their wedding plans until they could reside in the same state. On that tragic day in September 2008, Andrea Katz, Charles E. Peck's fiancée, was on her way to pick him up at the train station when she heard the shocking news of the Chatsworth crash on the radio. Peck's parents and siblings, who lived nearby in Los Angeles, rushed to join her in the ordeal that followed. For 12 agonizing hours after the collision, Peck's cell phone, lost in the wreckage, inexplicably placed call after call to his loved ones. His son, brother, stepmother, sister, and fiancé received a total of 35 calls during that nightmarish stretch. Each time they answered, they only heard static, and attempts to call back went straight to voicemail. Despite the eerie and heartbreaking nature of these calls, they fueled hope among Peck's family that he might still be alive, trapped somewhere amidst the wreckage. The incessant calls from Peck's phone prompted search crews to track the signal and focus their efforts once more on the location from which the calls originated, the wreckage of the first train. It was during this intensified search that Peck's body was finally discovered, about an hour after the calls abruptly ceased. Tragically, Charles Peck had died upon impact, yet in a haunting twist his cell phone continued to reach out to those he cherished most, inadvertently guiding rescuers to his remains. To this day, Peck's cell phone has never been found, leaving a poignant reminder of the enduring and mysterious ways in which loved ones can touch our lives, even after they are gone. As we reflect on these stories, we are reminded of the mysteries that accompany tragic events. The messages left behind by those who go missing or perish linger in our thoughts, stirring questions that may never find answers. These mysteries challenge our understanding of fate, resilience, and the boundaries between life and death. They compel us to contemplate the enduring power of hope and the profound impact of loss on those left behind. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Fireside Unsolved. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to help the channel grow. Until next time, take it easy and be easy, you filthy bastards.